Genshin players talk about artifacts a lot, but we often get it wrong. Take a look at these two artifacts for an electro damage DPS Raiden. They both have her ideal main stat and are from her ideal set. The only difference is their substats, but that's where they're really different. If you have spent any time at all thinking about artifacts, you'll probably feel like it's easy to tell at a glance which is better. Most people would think it's not even close. Most people would be mistaken. What if I told you that they're as good as each other, with just an insignificant gap in between? How on earth could that be true? Let's find out. First, a quick look at what stats we're aiming for here. Most characters built for elemental damage need a combination of 4 stats. Elemental damage bonus is the hardest to get and therefore the most valuable, arguably. Crit rate and crit damage are highly valued, and the character's base scaling stat is also important. In Raiden's case, her base stat is attack. However, Raiden's ideal build for an electro damage team is a little unusual because she has a passive which converts her energy recharge stat into electro damage bonus. This passive means that she benefits far more from ER than most characters, and is a bit of a coin flip whether she's better off with an attack sense or an ER one. Sometimes she can even use an attack goblet instead of an electro damage one. So, she needs a combination of attack, electro damage bonus, the 2 crit stats, and energy recharge. For this particular build, she benefits far more from having an ER sense than an attack one. This account only has those 2 ER sands in the emblem set, which is where this gets interesting. Since the emblem Shimenawa domain is always worth farming, we had spent a few weeks on it already before my partner pulled Raiden, so the moment she came home, there was already a fairly balanced build waiting for her. This initial build had a good spread across the relevant stats and a solid crit ratio. There are 2 common ways people measure artifact strength: crit value and roll value. Crit value is easy to calculate. You double the crit rate and add the crit damage. Roll value is also fairly simple. You count the number of times an artifact rolled into a relevant stat. Roll value can be made a bit more nuanced by weighing the value of the relative strength of the roll, though that generally requires online tools, so it takes more time and effort. Crit value is generally seen as the gold standard, though as we'll see in this video, it can be problematic. Roll value is less commonly used, and we'll see later on why it might actually be a better measure. For now though, let's focus on crit value. A crit value of 25 or above is considered by most to be fairly decent, though many people aim for 35 or even 40 for each slot before they consider a character to be well built. By this measure, 3 of the 5 artifacts are decent, and 1 is a little underpowered. Not ideal, but usable. The Sans, however, has a crit value of 0 and only 1 useful substat. As a result, many Genshin players would have scrapped this artifact without even trying to level it. However, this was the only onset artifact with the correct main stat in the account at the time. Over the course of the following year, Ratri continued to farm the emblem domain whenever he didn't have anything more important to spend his resin on. He was mostly looking for anything usable for a variety of characters, but the hope of getting a better Sans for his Raiden was always in the back of his mind. After all, by the most popular measure of artifact strength, the one she already had equipped was about as bad as it gets. In that time, he spent well over 10,000 resin in that domain. A couple of weeks ago, finally he struck gold. His second emblem energy recharge Sans started with 2 usable stats, crit rate and elemental mastery, plus flat defense, because of course. The final stat turned out to be crit damage. In the remaining rolls went almost entirely into the 2 crit stats, with only 1 wasted roll into defense. This lucky streak is about as good as it gets. The crit value of this new artifact is 32.6, which is an absolutely huge upgrade. He equipped it on his Raiden, took her out for a spin, and her damage was practically identical. So what gives? He fell into a common trap. With all the focus on crit value, it's far too easy to forget the importance of other stats. The original Sans had rolled a very strong 21% attack, and while the new artifact's crit value almost compensated for the drop in Raiden's attack, it didn't quite manage it. However, so far he was comparing Raiden's solo damage output. There are arguments in favor of valuing crit above other stats, and the most common one is that attack buffs are fairly easy to find, while crit buffs are fairly rare. These buffs naturally depend on what team you're using. The team we care about is Raiden Sunfire. It's fairly similar to the more popular Raiden National team, but with Jean instead of Xiangling. It has similar damage output to the national team due to the VV artifact set's resistance shreds, plus much greater survivability thanks to Jean's powerful healing and her debuff cleansing. Its main downside is that it's more reliant on intelligently placing Jean and Bennett's burst so that you can push or lure enemies into them, plus it's less effective against enemies resistant to Electro. Bennett's burst provides one of the best attack buffs in the game, and the 4-piece Noblesse artifact set provides a further boost. With these buffs active, the original build goes from 1900 to 3200 attack, while the new build goes from 1700 to 3000 attack. The strength of this buff means that the relative importance of Raiden's attack stat is lower, and the crit build ends up being more powerful, but only by a small margin. In the team she's intended for, while Bennett's buff is active, the updated Raiden build does a little under 5% more damage. However, since it can be difficult to keep enemies within the circle, and since the buff does not have 100% uptime, it's reasonable to expect the improvement to be just a couple of percent in practice. While that might seem like a decent improvement, when you think about the time investment it took to get there, it's surprisingly small. For comparison, a lot of people mindlessly spam Raiden's normal attacks during her burst. Learning to be more conscious about what attack chain to use causes a much larger improvement. The recommended chain results in a near 20% damage increase compared to mindless button smashing. And if you throw in some dash cancels, you can get even more. Similar improvements can be gained by being careful with your rotations. It all adds up, and obviously you can both optimize your artifacts and optimize your combos and rotations at the same time, but when the bad artifacts are so similar in strength to the good ones, it does beg a couple of questions. Is there a better way to compare artifact strength? And what else could we have done with all that resin? Roll value is a much less common method of evaluating artifacts, but personally I think I find it more valuable. Let's quickly demonstrate how it works. The original Sense started with one useful stat, rolled into two useless stats once each, and rolled 3 times into attack percentage, so it has a roll value of 4. Taking into account the strength of these rolls, Genshin Optimizer would give this stat a weighted roll value of 360%. The new Sense also started with one useful stat, rolled into one useless stat once, and rolled twice each into crit rate and crit damage, giving it a roll value of 5. The combined weighted value of these rolls comes to 420%. Nice. Note that for a different build or team comp, Elemental Mastery would be considered valuable or even more valuable than the other stats we're aiming for, so the new Sense would be even better for that scenario. For this team, it makes a small enough difference that it can be largely ignored. Even though this is a very rough measure of the artifact's value, it feels like a more accurate reflection of how they really compare to one another. The new one has a slight advantage, 16% according to the weighted values, but it's far closer than the crit value comparison would lead you to believe. This approach does result in builds which may undervalue crit when you take into account the availability of buffs, but for me personally, that trade-off is worth it. It's usually better at pointing towards a balanced build which doesn't require those extremely rare pieces which rolled entirely into crit, and as a result, it can make it easier to build a powerful character with much less investment. The main barrier to using this method is that the only way to know how many times an artifact has rolled into a specific stat is to know roughly how much each stat jumps with each roll, which takes a bit of getting used to. However, many calculators or optimizers online do a great job of displaying this information at a glance. For example, the Genshin Optimizer does a great job at this. It displays a different color to indicate how strong each roll was, plus a percentage to indicate the total roll strength of each stat. Despite that, I find it a much more useful way to give my characters a competitive build without spending months and months grinding artifacts for each item. It's hard to emphasize how important this is for me. The one thing which came close to making me lose my love for Genshin was the artifact grind, so a potential loss of a couple of percentage points of DPS is a price well worth paying. Regardless of whether you prefer to use crit value or roll value as an initial gauge for how good an artifact is, if you care about making the best decisions, using the online tools is really the only option. For artifact tweaking, I personally use the Genshin damage calculator the most, since it's fairly simple and gives me the exact information I want, a clear comparison between the damage output of two builds. The Genshin Optimizer is a little more fully featured and can automate artifact shuffling, but until Hoyo lets us have artifact loadouts, this isn't something I really have time for. For rotations, I use the Genshin Rotation app as a first pass to quickly get a feel for what my rotation should look like and figure out how best to get as much overlap between the different buffs and skills as possible. If I want to run some more detailed DPS comparisons to see the impact of slight tweaks to my rotations without having to go through the effort of counting damage numbers in game, I then import the rotations to the GC Sim and run a few scenarios there. Using a rough estimate for artifact value is a great way to help make decisions, and I've generally found that tweaking rotations is more effective at improving DPS to beat the Abyss. But it's great to have these tools available for those times when you want to make a decision between two builds. Guides and experts do often start by stating a target for both attack and energy recharge and expect you to optimize your crit after reaching those targets, but those caveats get lost in the noise. Focusing less on optimizing crit makes it a lot easier to farm for characters, which saves an absolute ton of resin. But if you're not farming for artifacts, what else is there to spend it on? Personally, I find it much more worthwhile to spread that investment across more characters. Aside from the simple enjoyment of having more characters to play with, this unlocks more varied teams and playstyles, which makes your account better prepared for the inevitable times when Hoyo decides to throw something unusual at us in the Abyss. People who have played consistently for a very long time may have reached a point where they don't actually have any new characters to build, but for a majority of players this isn't the case. If you're still playing catch-up, having that resin available makes a world of difference. It's still worthwhile keeping the idea of resin efficiency in mind, and the Emblem Shimenawa domain is still one of the most efficient places to spend your resin, but it can be worthwhile for your account's health and your own sanity to spread your resin to ley lines, boss fights, and weapon or talent material domains instead of pouring it all into artifact domains. There are also some other factors to take into account which the focus of crit value tends to overshadow a bit too much, many of which are fairly dependent on your personal preferences. For example, I prefer my characters to be as self-reliant as possible because I love experimenting with different teams, but I hate moving artifacts around. Until Hoyo gives us artifact loadouts, I'll generally refuse to rejig my builds, so it's important for me that I'm able to use a character without chaining them to someone like Benny for them to do decent damage. As before, it's perfectly valid to feel the other way around about that. Another gripe for me is that energy recharge is hugely undervalued by the focus on crit. This is definitely one which is mentioned in all the guides and which true experts do keep in mind, but many people give themselves a painful experience by ignoring ER in favor of too much crit, and then wonder why their teams feel painful to play. There's also a debate around what the ideal ratio is, be it 80 to 160 versus 60 to 200, though for me the differences there are so small that it's not worth the energy to think about. This debate also drowns out the nuance around how crit stats priority may differ for specific characters. I aim for a slightly higher crit rate for characters whose damage comes in small number of large hits, and slightly higher crit damage for those whose damage comes in a large number of small hits. If you don't do this and you have a burst focused character without a bias towards crit rate, people often have to repeat the Abyss over and over again until you get one lucky run which happens to crit consistently, which does not sound like fun to me. For someone with far more highly invested characters, their base damage might be strong enough to clear easily even if they don't crit, so some people might prefer the occasional gigantic number in spite of most runs being less impressive. It's natural to keep things simple, and the 1 to 2 crit ratio recommendation can be a valuable shorthand, but in a game like Genshin this often gets taken a little too far. Crit is valuable, but maybe not quite as big a deal as it might seem to some. If you're happy spending all your resin chasing the perfect build for your favorite character, then that's great. But if you're like me and you'd rather quit the game than see countless artifacts which started with potential end up rolling into trash, it's reassuring to know that you're not going to be as far behind as it might seem. I hope you found this helpful, but if you have any questions, leave a comment down below and a like if you'd like to see more. Until next time!